Live from the SABC's headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Good evening and welcome to this Wednesday edition of the Watchdog, dedicated tonight to today's testimony of President Cyril Ramaphosa before the State Capture Commission. Lots to highlight and unpack, ably assisted by analysts Ongama Mdimka and Lebohang Peko. The Watchdog starts now. President Cyril Ramaphosa kicked off his testimony with an opening statement that, among other things, sought to explain why he chose to stay in Jacob Zuma's cabinet, even when things went awry. He had 5 options, he told the commission this morning, the first of which was to simply resign.
While I would have earned quite a lot of praise from many quarters, this action of resignation would have significantly impaired my ability to contribute to bring about what I would call an end to state capture. It would have caught the big headlines, newspapers, and that would have been the end of it.
He didn't exercise that option. Option 2, he said, was to stay but speak out against the wrongs. But that too turned out to be a no option either.
There was also a limit to how confrontational one could be in the position that I held. A more confrontational approach would most likely have led to my removal from office, with the same consequences as resignation, in that my ability to effect change would have been greatly constrained, if not brought to an end.
After considering a couple of other options, 3 and 4, Cyril Ramaphosa says he could only settle for option 5.
The final option for me, which is what I chose, was to remain in my position as Deputy President, not to resign, not to acquiesce and go along and join in, or not to be confrontational, but to work with others in the executive to resist the abuses and bring about change where we could, and to sustain the work of social and economic transformation.
It was that option, Ongama and Lebohang, that later saw him making himself available for the position of ANC president at the party's 2017 elective conference, and ultimately becoming the president of South Africa after the 2019 national elections. Cyril Ramaphosa reckons he could not have done it any other way under the circumstances. And that approach, though, he insisted this morning, didn't mean that he kept a monastic silence the whole time Jacob Zuma abused his power. Let's get into, some of the things that he said there. I'm going to start with you, Lebohang, saying that, well, it was the best option he could have taken. Yes, many people may differ with him, but he still maintains that if he was to do it all over again, he would do it the way he did it. Your thoughts?
So, the option which was to stay and fight from within, ostensibly, it's an interesting hypothesis. I think that evidentially there are a few things that may perhaps be required. The one is that at the same time as this, there were several other quite prominent ANC leaders and some in the NEC even, who had also left, who resigned, who were quite vociferous in their protest and in their critique of some of the goings on at the time, particularly relating to what is, I think, lazily called state capture, but certainly some of the excesses between, state power, state resources, political favoritism, and so forth. The second piece of that is, I think, Ndade Cyril says that he did this as part of a team, so that there was a team of people from within who ostensibly were going to deal with this rot. It would be useful to understand what this team achieved and who, in fact, can corroborate what their benchmarks and their milestones were. And the third, I think, is really that this is, it's easy now to say and to cast oneself differently. And I think that this is politics, that it's easy in politics to recast, to rewrite, and to reframe one's role or lack of one's role, in fact, at very important moments in order to be seen to be at the right side of history. I think that Ndade Matomela shouldn't really be shy about expressing his own presidential aspirations. Indeed, speaking out in a particular way may have been costly, and in fact, it may have cost him his presidential aspirations. And if that was what he was going for, by all means. But I do think it's stretching the imagination a bit to believe that he stayed to fight a good fight from within, of which there is no real tangible evidence of what has been the dividend of this fight, what has been the curb in corruption, what have been the gains and the restitutions to the economy, to the people, to our democratic dividend that have resulted from this valiant fight that he speaks of.
Some of which we're going to get into during the program. Ongama, your take on his options and what he had to settle for in the end?
So I concur with what Lebohang has said. So let me not go down that route, bravouille. What I want to say is that in addition to her analysis, the issue here is that the president is accepting that the power of Jacob Zuma in the presidency was something to be feared. And then two, it confirms the work that was commissioned by the South African Council of Churches that contributed to our body politic, the existence of a power network which straddled party and state lines to create a monstrous being which was feared by those that sat at the higher echelons of power in South Africa from a formal perspective. So he accepts to the creation of a shadow government whose power was unfettered both at the level of the state and party. Because if all his options are those, what about the one that accrues to the ANC precisely because it is not the president of the republic who campaigns for office, but the party, and as such, who gets to be the president is elected from parliament. So the party itself was empowered to act, but by virtue of the fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa counts only these options, as opposed to, for example, the constitutionally legislated options such as a motion of no confidence and mobilizing at the level of the party to get rid of the deployee who had become too powerful. It's confirming again that the ANC itself was captured as a party through the power network, which our colleagues came up with in their analysis through the work of the South African Council of Churches.
The option he settled for in the end, though, Lebohang, he insisted this morning, didn't mean that, he kept a monastic silence the whole time Jacob Zuma was abusing his power. He says he offered to resign when Jacob Zuma replaced Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene with Des van Rooyen in an effort to capture treasury.
Yeah, he offered, and what became of that offer? I mean, I think that even in this, that's the only documented incidents that we have of this attempt to fight from within. I think indeed that
well, the other one he added, if I may just add, was the instance of the 30th of March 2017 removal of Pravin Gordhan and Cebisi Jonas as Minister and Deputy Minister of Finance, respectively.
Correct. But, Vuyo, there's nothing that was particularly spectacular about that. I mean, I think if we bear in mind that there was an outcry across Twitter, across taxi ranks, across offices, across people's kitchen tables, across, everywhere in this country, that is not really extraordinary. And I think that at the time when we're looking for extraordinary leadership and we're looking for people to take extraordinary risks for this leadership, we're looking for people who are going to take extraordinary risks for this country and to really show themselves to be willing to take the fall. He doesn't seem to have done that. There was nothing remarkable about being outraged about the appointment of Minister Desmond Roy. Everybody was outraged and puzzled and bemused by that very brief appointment of the so-called weekend special. I mean, we even, as in typical South African style, created colloquialisms and jokes about this. And it's really no laughing matter because it goes to the heart of a few things, some of which Ongama has spoken about, which is, deep statism, right? And the strongman tactics that have their tentacles across various layers of state, of the police, of the army, of the security machinery, and so forth. But also, in a way, it also speaks to the very over-centralized power of the executive and the executivization of the presidency. So the Constitution tells us that one of the key functions of the deputy president, and it's actually quite fuzzy, is to assist the president. It doesn't per se say how. It also mentions, of course, that he or she should be in charge of parliamentary business and party business in parliament. But beyond that, apart from deputizing for the president, it really becomes a relational issue. It becomes very much around how each president and their deputy correlate and how they configure their relationship, which I think is very problematic. So that worked for a Mandela and Mbeki, for example, which was a collegial relationship there was great equilibrium, and I think it was understood that Tata Mandela was going to hand over to Tata Mbeki. So there was this understudy relationship, and I think we are all aware that to all intents and purposes, the deputy president Mbeki then was the president de facto for many years before Tata Mandela stepped down. So I think that this lack of clarity around the role and the distinction of the presidency and the deputy presidency can give rise to the sort of quasi-authoritarian, autocratic tendencies, more than tendencies, tentacles of power that Ongama ably described, that we saw arising during the 9 years. But more than that is also, where are the other checks and balances? And I know we keep talking about constitutionalism and these checks and balances, particularly to curb the power of the president. We haven't heard enough about them. What we have as well is what we saw was what was basically a constitutionally enabled, almost what could have become a dictatorship. And I think that we should be very mindful that in future we are able to refract from that, because in future we have a character who is much less willing. I think that Zuma was quite a belligerent character about leaving office. We may eventually, because human personality can never be predicted, we may have an even more belligerent, much more stubborn entity who is unwilling to even give a semblance of a democratic constitutional performance.
Interestingly, Ongama, Cyril Ramaphosa, after that Nhlanhla Des van Rooyen episode, didn't offer his resignation to his boss. From what he said at the commission today, he offered it to Party Deputy Secretary General Jesse Duarte, and an interesting choice of words. He says, he goes on to say, he believes, quote unquote, that Jesse Duarte conveyed the message to the then president. And this is peculiar, especially given that, strictly speaking, he owed his cabinet position to Jacob Zuma, and he owes his party deputy presidency to the party. So he would have gone to Jesse Duarte for that, perhaps. But, I mean, for an offer to resign from cabinet, you have to take it to your boss, don't you?
You do. So it's an interesting one. Let's give it a benefit of doubt. So part of the play, in my view, would have been to appeal to a person who may have been seen to be part of the in-group or the power network, but with enough sense to try and manage the situation. Remember, Bravuyo, the president has already mentioned that he had already resolved that all the other four options were not available to him, were not ideal. So doing this is a tactical or strategic move to trigger a response from elsewhere, by engaging somebody who would have been seen to be part of the inner group without necessarily, but leaving him room enough for plausible deniability. You know what I mean? So this is somebody who was not only to take further the discussion that Lebogang was introducing earlier on. This is not somebody who was only altruistically concerned about, the need to fight within. This was also somebody who was mindful of what cards he needed to play in order to show enough participation in terms of, I'm also agitated, but without triggering what he feared, that he could be fired and therefore dislodged from the base from which to launch his campaign for the ANC presidency. So that's the thing. And then, Bravuyo, key question for me is, as the president wrapped that first part that relates to the ANC's role in this, to what extent has the party protected itself from the rise and dominance of power networks which may be crooked? Especially because the other thing here is that, for example, if you take the issue around Mr. Mafumadi's courageous attempts to play in the political space in order to save PRASA, if we take the Smolanyana skeletons thesis, it may be that part of what was debilitating for the party and the failure among some of the individuals that were powerful at a party level to take action when it was needed the most is not the altruism that is suggested, but also the fear that our own Smolanyana skeletons are also there, and therefore we may be actually held in check. So we were seeing they didn't act because they were in a Cold War, and some of these things that were manifesting were proxy battles of the bigger elephant in the room, people that felt vulnerable to the president, and he could use whatever power he had in order not just to fire them, maybe to pursue them legally.
Right. The commission, of course, was very much interested in what Cyril Ramaphosa did or didn't do with whatever power he had while he was still deputy president, no matter how little that power may have been. That's what we look at next. Don't go away. Welcome back, and if you've just joined us, we're looking at President Cyril Ramaphosa's testimony before the State Capture Commission. Day one, it was. Today he is going back tomorrow. I'm ably assisted this evening by Ongama Mdimka and Lebogang Pheko. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa led the Eskom war room during the time he was deputy president. That, of course, war room was meant to, one, address the electricity challenges facing the country at the time, and two, to oversee the turnaround of Eskom. Now, something interesting that the president said today. I want to take a listen to what he had to say when he was asked about a turnaround plan submitted to him and his team by the then CEO, Sidiso Matuna.
Do you have any recollection of him, Mr. Matuna, presenting a strategy, turnaround strategy, that he had prepared for Eskom to you?
Yes, I do recall that. I would not immediately now know the full contents thereof without having renewed my own recollection of it. Yes, I mean, Eskom always had a number of ideas of how it can be turned around, and one of his would have been one of those as well. So yes, one does recall that, but I also recall the reports, or rather the provision of information as it is set out here in the document that the Technical War Room had requested, because the Technical War Room needed to deal with information that had to be provided by Eskom itself.
Lebohang, this was very interesting for me because, I mean, part of his brief, or part of the brief of that war room was to oversee the turnaround of Eskom. And here's someone you've brought in, to run this entity, and they hand you a turnaround plan. You have no recall of it, Boan. But it also suggests that you didn't take this person seriously. But as someone said earlier, it also suggests that perhaps you are sleeping on the job. You are not focused on that, because the first thing, or at least among the first things you would have done, or the most obvious things you ought to have done, was to look at what the people in the system are telling you. And then, of course, find fault if that's the direction you need to go. And then, decide what to do next. Someone is suggesting that he slept on the job on this one. Your thoughts?
So, I mean, remember who was in the war room at the time. It was the Department of Energy, Cooperative Governance, Public Enterprises, National Treasury, Economic Development, Water and Sanitation, and Eskom itself. So this was really far from being a one-person committee, some committee in a canoe somewhere. It was, an all-encompassing, intersectional, interdepartmental grouping of people, all of whom were brought there with particular technical and political expertise. Because remember that these are not only, regrettably, technical matters; they're also the politics behind them, and the politics of who's deployed into some of these processes, which is a conversation for another day. But it was also really speaking into quite a few fundamental, firing up the economy, public and municipal, opening up public buildings, public and municipal business spaces, and so forth. Now, in the midst of all of this, I think the other thing that's quite notable is that Matomela, who also claiming that he wasn't aware of Brian Molefe's connections with the Gupta family and so forth. And I do think that it is important for us not to isolate capture to this particular moment, but I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. I don't even think it's a case of sleeping on the job for you. I do think that there's such a thing in politics as strategic amnesia, which might be what we're witnessing here, because I think it's very difficult to imagine or to fathom that the pronouncements that we saw at the time, and I remember very clearly, I think it was 2014 or 15, that Matomela say coming out on TV on a program such as this, I guess, which was broadcasting it, saying that the lights are back on. We said we would do it. You gave us X amount. I think that it was a 2-month turnaround, and the lights are on. It is difficult to imagine that a person of his standing, of his professional and, of course, intellectual prowess cannot recall any of this. I think that also that, other than the political and the verbal gymnastics that is taking place here, we also see, the attempt to reposition and to realign themselves, as I said earlier, with a different historical epoch. So the epoch of heroism and the epoch of, I think, trying to disconnect and dislocate oneself from what has occurred. I do think it will be very difficult as history is written for Ntate Matomela, and even if we go back a bit further, Ntate Mohlante, who was also a Zuma deputy, to discount themselves and remove themselves from the so-called missing decade, because at the very least, they helped to give away some of those decades themselves.
From where you sit, Ongama Mtimka, I mean, the person, in charge of overseeing the turnaround of Eskom, simply not really taking the CEO at the time, Koptu. And mind you, this is a person who, even on his account, today was brilliant, he was committed, he was one of the best public servants, senior public servants that they had.
Indeed, Bravuya. So I think that left me with a degree of disappointment, especially also the sense of powerlessness that the former president, the deputy president, and now president created about the role that they were playing in that war room. On one level, there were claims of success, which they wanted to be in the forefront of. On another, the mistakes done, such as the firing of that executive led by Tsidiso Motana, then there's an attempt to deflect responsibility there and shine it on President Zuma. Granted, that could be the case. But my view, and the president says his own agency there was that because they got reduced into a non-entity as the war room, when that action was taken against the Matona executive, then they, suddenly he was an activist for dropping that war room and advancing for moving for the appointment of a more, permanent and in inverted commas qualified chief executive to take over at Eskom, as opposed to the war room intervention, because of the fact that while they were still there, a process was started which kind of made their power, the whole idea behind them irrelevant.
Lebohang, it was Cyril Ramaphosa who brought Brian Molefe to Eskom.
It was indeed, by all accounts. Yes, by all accounts, it was indeed. And I think, the interesting thing about all of this is, again, I'd like us to levitate around a couple of issues. And the one is really the efficacy of state-owned enterprises and how cadreship deployment has a role to play in either enhancing that efficacy or in completely decimating it or compromising it, as has been the case. The second piece is really the linearity of SOEs in any case. So if we look back at the history of SOEs in this country, what we're seeing isn't new, gents. It's really part of, the ways in which, for example, the Afrikaner Dom wanted to recreate and create a fiction of an Afrikaans middle class, SOEs as really a dumping ground or an exit plan for, little Friki, little Jacob or whoever. And I think that what we're seeing is a reenactment and a re-entrenchment of the same idea that SOEs are a place where you go and work for your uncle, right? Kiko malume go SOE. And this kind of malume mentality seems to be quite entrenched in our body politic and in our public administration of these entities. And I mean, just to give a few figures, for example, of what it has cost us so far, for example, that the failing SOEs have so far accrued a debt of close to 2 trillion rands, and that at some point they had a combined GDP debt estimate of about 55% of GDP, which was, and Eskom itself had a debt equivalent which was about 8% of South Africa's entire GDP. So the bailouts and the support to these balance sheets at the state, at the expense of other functioning ways of doing business and of what SOEs should be. If we look at the way SOEs were run across other post-independent countries, I'll use Zambia because that's a very familiar context to me. Countries like Zambia and Kenya and so forth, where you had SOEs as an instrument to build small businesses, to build local production, local expertise, and to ensure that there was an internal value chain. Right, so the copper belt, and the mining belt, the mining sector, and so forth, were governed by particular state-owned enterprises in relation to pricing, in relation to taxes and tariffs, in relation to international costs. We are not seeing any form of economic activism that the state-owned enterprises are playing in this country.
I mean, Cass, who was, in Cyril Ramaphosa's corner on this one, because, I mean, Myeni, talking about the suspension of Matona, was that the war room that was headed by the deputy president at the time was actually not getting information from Eskom. And what's interesting here is that it is Cyril Ramaphosa who gets to be, or whose argument gets to be beefed up by Myeni on this one. And apparently Lynn Brown also raised similar concerns. Yet when the president gets asked about, how this information gets collated and who does it go to, who listens to the president, or who does the president get to hear from and believe. So no, there were many of us, and so I really can't tell. Ongama?
Sure. So that was interesting, Prof. Before I get there, please, if I may chip into this similar issue around the chain of communication and the conflict which the president didn't realize on this issue of I whispered the name of Brian Molefe to President Zuma. Quickly, Prof. So I doubt that the president was prepared to hear the follow-up questions that were going to come from the commission. Plus, I think that the commission missed an opportunity to kind of get to the bottom of that flow of communication. And I think this is something that would be interesting to determine. So he says he whispered the name of Brian Molefe to President Zuma. Then the commission raises up Lynn Brown's evidence that, look, by the way, that's part of the problem around this state capture thing, because that name was not the preferred name out of the process that had been followed in order to determine the next chief executive at Eskom. Now, obviously, the commission didn't follow through here because I felt that they should have asked the president, unless they did it while I was away, that Mr. President, did you now suggest this name as part of, in fact, they did ask, as part of your deployment committee role or not? And I think by then, that's when he realized that now, okay, maybe I mustn't accuse him. But for all of a sudden, the president forgot the flow of communication now as to, whether these were minutes of a deployment committee meeting. But he did say that he had the experience. Back to your question, Bravo, he had the experience of working with Brian Molefe. Back to your question, I think that it does happen that when there's an existing power network a shadow government, a deep state, a captured state, that the normal visible state gets compromised in terms of flow of information. I know that Machela Koko, for example, took exception to that the very notion of creation of a war room, which is led by politicians when Eskom had an executive leadership structure and a board. But giving a benefit of doubt to the turnaround process, one would think that part of the complaints about the failure of information to flow to even this, which was a weakened structure as per Machela Koko, would have been the fact that there was an existing shadow operating platform, which may have even included the Gupta executives and accounting to Saxon World, which may explain why certain the official and visible platforms would be deprived of information in favor of the deep state networks.
Very quickly, before I move on from this one, Leohang, how important is it, or was it, for this issue of Cyril Ramaphosa saying he was the one, who whispered Brian Moleife's name, who, of course, got to be the person who was eventually appointed, given, what has been the popular narrative all along?
Yeah, I mean, I think what has played out is that Brian Moleife was parachuted in as a super sub, right? As a super CEO. He came highly recommended. His reputation at PIC, at Transnet preceded him. And it seemed as though he would be able to, he had the gravitas and the technical know-how and wherewithal to be able to then seemingly and seamlessly navigate us through the Eskom quagmire. Now, I think it was very unfortunate that this was done at the back of a very competent CEO who preceded him, Tidiso Matona, and I think who was removed in ways that are clumsy and really quite uncalled for. And I think that this is really also goes to the really difficult link between technocratism and political deployment in this country and in any country, which is probably why many countries prefer the model of having a solid linear base of cadreship, of technocratic cadreship, who don't per se have party political alliances and allegiances, but who rather serve the process and who rather serve the state. We are not there because of the nature of many African political battles and the contours of post-independent politics, which are mired in colonial relations and, of course, colonial power, colonial institution building, which is sometimes quite uncomfortable for us. But of course, we are not Sweden, we are not Norway. I do, however, think that there's a case to be made for the accountability that then presents to Matomela Ramaphosa, because it then removes this notion that this was Zuma's boy. It shifts the onus and it shifts the historical narrative quite significantly as well.
Okay. Now, the then Deputy President of the ANC also chaired the party's deployment committee. Now, apart from the fact that they were not, for a while, that committee didn't even have minutes, but the chair of the committee, the deployment committee, could not recall who were some of the people that decided to deploy at Eskom, given the responsibility he had. Turning it around and, dealing with the crisis that we're confronting as a company. I don't know what you made of that, Ongama.
I think here the challenge is that I'm uncomfortable, Bravoyo, with this forgetfulness in crucial moments. And also, I think the president should have blatantly said that they just didn't want to keep minutes as a party for the deployment committee, maybe because of fears of leaks or the sensitivity of what they were doing, and just deal with that honestly, rather than we need to improve processes. I mean, the ANC is an age-old organization. What was an issue, though, for me, which again the Commission missed following up on, is the admission, or in fact, proudly presenting the subjecting of state processes to ANC processes. The president is right. Everybody is entitled to lobby, and lobbying is an accepted practice in a democracy. However, when you subject the final decision-making of a state-level process to the party political processes of a governing party, that's something we should be frowning upon. That's something that the Commission should actually follow up on in writing its own report. Because, Bravuyo, it's one thing for the ANC to recommend candidates. It's another to say, after following an open application process and recruitment process, before a final decision is made, which is a matter of the state, the party again gets roped in. That to me, that sounds very corrupt. The president proudly presented it, same as Gwede Mandashe, and I find it strange that the Commission doesn't challenge this notion. I mean, no one really should care about the existence of the deployment committee or its processes, but where its existence imposes on state processes, then that's a problem for me. Again, just to take on this idea of getting capable people in order to run the state. Francis Fukuyama writes in Political Development and Decay that part of the development of political systems includes the allocation of opportunities and employment of people in positions no longer on the basis of kinship and friendship, but more on the basis of merit as political systems develop. Once political systems start decaying, a crucial part of decaying is the allocation of opportunities, whether it be business or employment, on the basis of kinship and friendship. That's a key feature of decaying political systems. And I think that the ANC should stop this thing, because it's what has actually led to the problems that we have, where you find that executives become bigger than their political principals because they were, recommended by the party or vice versa.
In fact, in the instance of PRASA, the CEO was appalled that, the chairperson of the board was appointed without him being consulted. But let's take a listen to this other bite from the president.
As I indicated earlier, some appointments came to the deployment committee, some did not.
But would it not be highly unlikely that the appointments of an entire board of such an important entity as Eskom would escape the attention of the deployment committee? Is it not highly unlikely?
We're dealing here with a period where a lot of things were happening without the line of sight of a number of people. So it is that type of situation we are dealing with.
So again, shifts, the conversations. No, that deployment committee is suddenly also not really fully in charge, of these processes. There are a lot of other things that were happening, behind people's backs, things that people were supposed to be in the know actually didn't know about. And this was particularly interesting for me because later on the president then, in fact, was the evidence leader who then gets to read the then Deputy President's response in Parliament to a question that was apparently raised by IFP MP Singh, who had said at the time that, okay, you have all these problems, blah, 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 blah. You know, when are you fixing them? Then the president says, then Deputy President, the problems are being fixed as we speak, you know? So what would then would have probably followed from those, like, so on what basis were you then saying problems were being fixed, or what happened to account for what you actually said in Parliament, you know, which is where the executive accounts, you know, for its actions or non-actions. But what was interesting for me is that the president didn't go there, but instead, you know, said this.
Well, there's a prior paragraph which I thought you might have wanted to refer to, where Mr. Singh says, Mr. Chairman, that we know, Honorable Deputy President, that you've been handed the poisoned chalice. And the evidence leader is handing me another poisoned chalice.
So I'm not going to account for what I said, but it's important for me to raise this issue. What Singh said earlier, that I had been handed a poison chalice. So what did you expect me to do? Lebohang?
Yeah, it's not easy to absorb it's difficult. And I think that there's a few things that come to mind, other than the sort of the selective memory and the political amnesia that seems to come to play at particular moments, is also the non-linearity of this. So at particular moments, we advised that the war room was part of the plan, and then there's a complete forgetfulness around that. But I also think that the forgetfulness is to do with the very important and strange relationships that take place between, political, social, and technocratic concessions, and how consensus is run, consensus is arrived at, political consensus is arrived at in South African politics. It's often very separate from or subject to processes outside Parliament and even processes that are outside the NEC. And this is where this really strange quagmire that lies state versus party, state versus government, and then government versus party. There's also the distinction between being a governing party versus being a ruling party. A lot of the languaging, and I think that, earlier on, you were speaking about the lack of minutes. That's partly, I'm not even trying to defend anything or anybody, but that's also part of the tradition of how many liberation movements ran things, guerrilla style, where things were not written down. And I think that it's a convenient habit that seems to have continued when moments like this arise. It's also fair to say that this used to be useful. This used to be this kind of consensus building between the state, the party, and the government was doable because the ANC, at least until about 2012 or 13, had a huge party parliamentary presence. That has since eroded. And with that erosion, the fragilities of having such a massive stake in party and parliamentary power have also begun to erode the sense of stability that other people, that the public feel around the sense of power. And I think that this also means that there are going to be huge, ramifications that go beyond the political power and the political lives of individual protagonists. All of these things are playing out, and I think we should be very blunt. What we're also seeing playing out at the Zondo Commission is the deep fragmentation between state and party, government and party, and of course the deep fragmentation that many of us have been speaking about for a long time, and the slight definite decline of the African National Congress. And I wonder whether this is the conversation that in fact the president himself and others among us are willing to have. What is at stake is not just what we're seeing playing out there, but the core of a movement that's over 100 years old.
A quick closing comments from you, Ongama?
We're at the crux of the president's reluctance to answer the question, is this realization that not only did they remain with a view to fighting from within, but they continued to promote the acceptance by South Africans of the destruction that was underway. They actively campaigned for it. The party threatened people who wanted to actually speak out against. So it was not just the power network that was speaking out, that was threatening people, but the party itself. Many instances, you had Gwede Mandashe going to meet with the ANC caucus in parliament to say, you're not going to vote against President Jacob Zuma and vote with the opposition. And they came up with all these, I'm sorry to say, nonsensical arguments about why the enemy motions could not be supported. And theirs was the greatest betrayal of South Africa. So if there's any concerns about 9 wasted years, the ANC is not only accused, number one, it is now showing us that it has failed to protect its candidate selection processes in order to ensure that in future we don't have it captured by crooked elements that are going to ensure that they continue to dominate the state.
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has told the Commission that it's not all doom and gloom, that since taking over as president in 2018, he has undertaken several measures to end state capture, to rebuild damaged institutions, and to foster a culture of ethical public service and accountability. Take a listen.
On your dashboard, through the SOE Council, we will have right across the board, we will have a proper line of sight of what is happening in each state-owned enterprise, from the balance sheet management to the income statement management, to the boards, how they function, and to also the operational issues as the reports come through. So through this new process that we have now introduced, which will be perfected in a little while, we will be able to have that line of sight. So we could say that, yes, the errors have occurred, as I have admitted here, but the process we're going to have now is going to be much, much better than what we've got now.
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa will be back at the State Capture Commission tomorrow, but that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.